Shalom. Calendar club.
Welcome.
Shalom. Shalom.
Shalom.
Okay, let's get started.
Okay, well, some of you might be wondering what Yah's covenant calendar has to do with a tree. And this is going to be a tree in Daniel chapter 4. And as we get into today, I just hope that you have a lot of fun with it. You don't really have to have your Bibles open. We'll be going through the verses on the screen. But just before we start, and maybe some of you don't know the answer to this question right now, but we're going to be looking at a tree that was cut down, and it is a vision. And we want to know if there was an interpreter in the vision that was given to Daniel. Just what happened, because a lot of these visions needed to have an interpreter. So this is from Daniel. It is actually a number 3 out of a series of 8 called Declaring the End from the Beginning. And Daniel chapter 4 is a very interesting portion of this, declaring the end from the beginning. So we're going to be having a little look at some English lessons today, believe it or not. We've talked about Grammar 101 in the calendar studies and what it means to understand our grammar and our English. I'm using this verse from Isaiah 46, 9 and 10, one of my very favorite verses. It just has a golden thread through all of the calendar studies. It's just awesome. So this is what Isaiah says. One of the 7 times in his book, between chapters 40 and 48, you will find this concept. Remember the former things of old, for I'm Yahweh, and there is none else, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all of my pleasure. You're going to find that verse is really, really an interesting verse. You'll find it all over the place. That's why we're saying that when you understand calendar in the Torah, you'll also be able to understand timelines in the last book of Revelation, and of course, everything in between. Well, in the book of Daniel, King Nebuchadnezzar actually had 2 of the visions. He had a vision there in chapter 2, and there was another vision in chapter 4. And they were very interesting visions, both of them quite different. I'm just hoping that some of you know a little bit about both of these chapters. But let's just look very briefly at chapter 2. This was the king's very first vision in Daniel chapter 2. But the king could not remember this vision. No matter what he tried, he could not remember what he dreamt. This vision needed to have an interpreter. It was for this image made of metals and clay. They never had images like that. Their images were maybe solid wood or solid stone, but this one was very different. And the Chaldeans were called in to tell the king what this vision meant. And of course, they were there. And you know, if you didn't really please the king, sometimes you could lose your head. But these Chaldeans failed the test miserably. They couldn't tell him. And they said, well, king, if you would just tell us what what it is, at least we could tell you what it meant. But he couldn't even remember. So he said, you know what, you're just no good to me. And he issued a death decree. This is the second time in the book of Daniel that you're going to find a death decree. There was one in chapter 1 as well. Well, Daniel was the appointed man. He heard about this death decree, and he said, you know what, I think we better do something about this. And of course, they prayed, him and his 3 friends, and you all know what happened. He was given the vision that night. Now, this vision had something to do with the events surrounding Yah's people. That's what the visions are in the book of Daniel. They're about all of the events that are always surrounding Yah's people. It's not going to be about other different cultures that were pagan. It will talk about them and how they, were stumbling blocks to Yah's people. But this vision was very special. It's going to give, basically, it's a very simple vision that gives a very broad outline of the prophecies from Daniel's day, around 600 BC, right to the end of time. But in Daniel chapter 2, there are no timelines. Like I said, it's a very special vision, and it's a very simple vision. Well, Daniel did interpret chapter 2 to the king and told him all about it. We're going to just pop into that a little bit later on. We have 60 slides here, so you can fasten your seatbelts. But anyway, the king had another vision, and he wrote this chapter in Daniel chapter 4. He is actually the author. Yes, Daniel wrote it down, but King Nebuchadnezzar is the one. And this is a little bit different in this vision. He remembers his dream, and he remembers there was a huge tree. It was just absolutely huge. But in this vision, there was a divine decree instead of a death decree. A little bit different. This vision didn't have anything to do with Yah's people. It was a vision surrounding the events of only the king. And again, it's a very simple vision, but this vision has a timeline of 7 years. He calls in his Chaldeans, his court. Can you tell me the meaning of this dream? No, they couldn't. They failed again. And so there was Daniel. He was the appointed man again. So if it wasn't for Daniel, King Nebuchadnezzar would have been hooped. But anyway, as you read the story, it's just very interesting. And most of us think it's just a very simple story, but there's a lot of concepts and principles behind chapter 4. We're going to be looking at chapter 2 first, just a tiny bit. This image was given to the king in his dream as an idol word picture to the king. In fact, that dream was so different that he could not even remember it. And a divine interpretation was needed, and it was given by Daniel. Why could not the king understand the dream? Because it was symbolic. It had a symbolic significance, and Daniel was the one that was going to tell him what the symbols meant. Of this image that had a gold head, silver arms, a brass belly, and then iron legs, and then feet of iron and clay. But we have this question that keeps coming up. Why was the second dream remembered by the king and not the first one? Well, the second vision was just about an ordinary tree, just an ordinary tree. And he had no difficulty remembering every detail of that dream. But the Chaldeans couldn't answer the question of the king of what the dream meant. And as you read through chapter 4, Daniel is called in to tell him what the dream meant. But now, this is the question for chapter 4. Is this dream symbolic or literal? And maybe you don't know the difference between those terms. We're going to work on that today. This was an ordinary tree. So we have to figure out if this vision is a symbolic vision or a literal one, because they get treated a little bit different when it comes to timelines. So this vision of the tree, is it going to follow structural components that are given in Daniel chapter 2? Now, I did 2 other teachings before this to explain these structural components. So I'm going to give you the answer right now. The answer is yes. And we'll do a little bit of work on that so you can understand what I mean. Daniel has written his book with a very amazing structure. This is a review slide, but for those of you that are new, let me try to go through this a little bit. This is a thumbnail structure for Daniel chapter 2. It was a vision of an image that had a stone that was cut out of a mountain without hands. If you can just imagine a big mountain back here. The first part of the vision is about the image, and this is representing the pagan kingdoms around Yah's people. This stone that is cut out of a mountain without hand represents part 2 of this vision. This stone actually represents the 144,000 that are cut out of a mountain Yah's hand cut them out of this mountain. That's another study. But this is the second part of the vision, where at the very end of time, right down here in the toenails of this vision, where things are wrapping up, is when the 144,000 are going to come and bring their loud cry message and a harvest message to the world. And then this image crashes down. Basically, that's what's happening. So we have two parts to this vision. But the vision works this way. The first thing that you'll see is that there is a heavenly scene. And the heavenly scene that was given to Nebuchadnezzar was this dream. After the heavenly scene, you will see an interlude question. It always follows in every single vision. There will be a question. It's basically Daniel saying, what happened here? Like I saw the vision, now what's going on? I don't understand everything. It's a question, whether the king asks it or Daniel asks it. Following this interlude question, you come to another section. And every vision, there's 5 of them in Daniel, every vision will have this, is called a historic prophetic outline. This is where the vision, the heavenly vision, is given the interpretation so you can understand what it means. We'll do a little bit more work on that later on. And then right after that, something really neat happens, is that's where you get the answer to this interlude question. Interlude is just another kind of a fancy word for the word interruption. This interlude interrupts the heavenly scene from the actual interpretation. So there, after the interpretation is given, you get the answer to that question. And then, of course, at the end, what to expect, the end time event. You will see every single vision in Daniel's book have this very same structure. These components are never ever mixed up. They're always in the same order. And guess what we call this? This is a forward progressive movement. Those are some of the most important words that you'll remember for Daniel. Everything has to move forward. In this vision of Daniel 2, and like I said, every other vision, all the verses have to move forward. You start at verse 1. And you follow the verses through in order right to the end. So all the verses have to have a forward progressive movement. So you won't get to verse 10 and then in the interlude question back up to verse 4. It always goes forward. But guess what? These kingdoms, there is different kingdoms as well. And those are all in a forward progressive movement. And there's dates connected. There's all kinds of dates, and the dates have to be in a forward progressive movement. So that's kind of another teaching. But this pattern is very, very simple. Now, when I started out working in Daniel and actually published it, I didn't realize until after the book was published that Daniel chapter 4 follows this same structure. And that's what I want to show you right now. He has the very same structural pattern. We're just going to compare Daniel 2 here on the left with Daniel 4 on the right. Forward progressive movement. So number 1, the king relayed the vision from the heavenly scene. Just like Daniel 2 starts out with a heavenly scene, so does Daniel 4. Starts out with a heavenly scene, was a vision from heaven. The very next thing that happened after that in Daniel 2, there was a question. Same thing happens in Daniel chapter 4. The king had a question. What does this mean? What's going on here? And then the third component here is the outline that tells you what the vision actually meant. In Daniel 2, this is a symbolic vision. So the interpretation is the literal application of what the vision meant. Here in chapter 4, this is where we have the dream given an application. I have interpretation there. We're gonna open these terms here in a little bit, but anyway, that follows the same pattern as Daniel 2. And then you have your answer to your question in the very same spot, and then you have the end time event. Now, what I'd like you to notice is that in chapter 2, we have verses 1 to 19. Then it follows with verse 26. This is your forward progressive movement. Then from verses 36 to 43, you're moving forward, and then you go to verse 44 for your answer, and 45 is the end time event. Everything's in order, nicely lined up in order. Same thing happens in Daniel 4. We have the heavenly scene recorded in verses 10 to 17. Following that, in verse 18, is the interlude question, an interruption there. And then in verse 22 is where you begin to have this interpretation broken open. Verse 25 is where you have your answer to your question. And then verses 31 to 33 is the end time part of this vision. So all the verses are in order. You're looking for order in Daniel. He's got it all arranged just perfectly. But that's not all. He does this in Daniel 2 and Daniel 4, and also he has this same perfect structural pattern in Daniel 7, in Daniel 8, and in Daniel chapters 10 to 12. So Daniel 7, this is actually your second vision around Yah's people. Daniel 8 and Daniel 9 actually is a component as well. That's your third vision around Yah's people, and 10 to 12 is the fourth vision. Chapter 4 is just a vision of the king. It doesn't really have anything to do with Yah's people, but it does tell us a lot, Yah's people, what to do with timelines. So, what is Daniel 4 all about? Well, as I was growing up in my church, this is what they taught me. Chapter 4 is just a chapter about the king has to be humbled. He just had such a prideful spirit, and he had to be humbled, and humbled a lot. That is a traditional emphasis that is happening. Yes, there was a conflict between the pagan king's pride, which is arrayed against divine sovereignty. In fact, if you read in verse 30 of chapter 4, you will find that King Nebuchadnezzar said, "Is not this great Babylon that I have built?" Was he forgetting something? I just wonder. But you know, at the very end of the vision, Yah wins, as the king is turned out to eat grass, until at last the king decides to give honor to Yahweh, the creator of heaven and earth. And you will see that in verse 37, where he says, "The king of heaven, he is able to abase." So that's what I was taught, that chapter 4. It just meant that the king had to be humbled. But I'm here to tell you today that there are some concepts in Daniel chapter 4 that provide connecting principles for all timelines in Daniel and in Revelation. And there's concepts there as well for timelines in the Gospels. In fact, these timelines in prophecy actually tell us where we are in the stream of prophetic time. Everybody wants to know, especially now with so many things happening in the world. It's like, is the world going to end? Well, the timelines are the ones that have these secrets. That's the question. Where are we in the stream of time? Well, let's just take a little look at some timelines of Daniel and Revelation and see what we can find out with these concepts in Daniel chapter 4. Because there's a lot of timelines. And that's what prophecy is about, so that you can understand these timelines and know what's going on. So let's look at some timelines in Daniel. The very first timeline is found in chapter 4. It's very interesting that there was no timelines given in any visions that had to do with Yah's people until the timeline is explained on how to use it. And that happens in chapter 4. In Daniel 7, there's another timeline. It's called, when you break it open, literally, it's a 1260-year timeline, and it's called a time and a times and a dividing of time. In Daniel 8, there's a timeline with the number 2300. In Daniel 9, there's a lot of timelines. There's a 70-week timeline. There's a 69-week timeline. a 62-week timeline, there's a 7-week timeline, and then a 1-week timeline, and there's 2 timelines that are a half a week long each. So there's a lot of timelines in Daniel 9. And then in Daniel 12, there are 3 very controversial timelines. One is 1,260 days, one is 1,290 days, and the last one is 1,335 days. And they're specifically days, not years. The reason that I did this teaching in Daniel to understand Daniel chapter 4 is because the Daniel 12 timelines are very controversial, especially in the denomination that I was raised in, because they say that these timelines of 1260, 1290, and 1335 all were not days, they were years of 1,260 years, 1,290 years, and 1,335 years. So they belong in the time frame of the Dark Ages, not at the end of time. But very interesting, Daniel tells us exactly where those timelines belong. And we won't be doing that study in this series right now. But he tells you exactly where those timelines belong and why they are there. Guess how? Through that structure that I was showing you, when you look at the structure of all of his visions. But Revelation has a lot of timelines as well. In Revelation 2, there's a timeline of 10 days. In Revelation 8, there's a timeline that says about a half an hour. In Revelation 9, where it's talking about your 5th trumpet, there is 2 times a timeline of 5 months is mentioned. It's there twice. In Revelation 11, look at the 3 timelines. There's a 42 months, there's a 1260, and there's also a 3.5 days. This is a really interesting timeline, this one here. In Revelation 12, there are 2 timelines mentioned that actually add up to 1260. In Revelation 13, it talks about a timeline of 42 months. In Revelation 17, there are 2 timelines that are each an hour long. And in Revelation 18, you have a timeline of 1 day, and you have 3 timelines of 1 hour. And then in Revelation 20, it talks about a 1,000-year timeline. So there's a whole lot of timelines between Daniel and Revelation. In fact, around at least 17. So that means that timelines are probably pretty important. So what Daniel wants to do is to make sure that you know how to work with timelines so that you can break those open. Timelines. They're just a really special light to break open prophecy. If you don't understand them and you don't know how to work with them, you'll be lost. And even those that do know how to work with them, it's still a puzzle. But I'm here to tell you today that I believe that Daniel chapter 4 is the authority of the whole scriptures to tell you how to work with timelines. And of course, there's a timeline in the Gospels of 3 days and 3 nights. It's pretty special. But like I said, I was focusing in this study on the Daniel 12 timelines, and they're very interesting. The 1260, which it can also be 42 months. It's got several different ways to break it open in different terminology. We'll talk about that later. That 1290, what's all that about? And the 1335. And there has been theologians and people all over the last 2,000 years trying to figure out what these timelines mean. And like I said, I really do believe that Daniel has the ultimate authority. He was a pretty smart man. So the question, everybody, is going to be this. This is the question for Daniel chapter 4. Is Daniel chapter 4 a symbolic vision, or is it a literal vision? And does it matter? Why does it matter? Why is this such an important question? Well, let's just take a little look. We're going to enter into 7 main points for understanding these timelines. We're not going to do all 7 today. We will do 3 today, and then we'll do the rest in the next 2 parts. But I'm going to show you the outline and how this works. The very first one we're going to look at is the use of symbols as compared to the use of metaphors and similes. What in the world does that mean? Symbols, metaphors, and similes. It's going to be a grammar lesson. Number 2, we're going to look at the distinction between symbolic language and literal language, and how to really know what the language is of a vision. Just because it's a heavenly vision does not mean it's always a symbolic vision. We're going to find that out. And then point number 3, and this is going to be a little bit of a tricky one to understand. We're going to look at the distinction between interpretation of a vision and application of a vision. Interpretation and application. So this might be something new, and it might be a little bit difficult, but it really it isn't. It's not too hard. Number 4, we're going to try to understand the terms prophetic terminology and prophetic time. I have found over the years that a lot of people think that these terms are identical. They mean the same thing, and they absolutely do not mean the same thing. Number 5, we're going to look at the repetition of prophecy and its consequences. What in the world could that be? Number 6, we are going to look at the theologian's argument and the sneaky switch. That's a really fun section to look at. What in the world have the theologians been doing? Have they been pulling a sneaky switch on us and we didn't know? Well, Daniel's going to expose them. And number 7, we're going to look at how prophetic timelines begin and how they end. That's going to be that's really going to be fun there at the end. But today, we're just going to look at these first 3. We're going to look at the use of symbols, metaphors, and similes, and how we can find out the difference between a symbolic language and literal language. How can we really know the difference? And then this interpretation and application. So just a little bit of work on this tree first. The description of the tree in Daniel chapter 4 just used simple words. It was a great, strong tree. It reached to the heavens. And it says the tree could be seen by everyone. It also says that it had fair leaves, much fruit, and there was food for everybody. And also it said there was shade for the beasts and nests for the birds. And then it also said that there was a watcher that came and hewed down the tree. In fact, when you read it, it sounds like just a really good children's story. And then it goes on to say that the branches of the tree were cut off, the leaves were shaken, and the fruit was scattered. And not only that, the beasts and the birds fled from the tree. Get away from here. They left. The tree stump was bound with iron and brass, and there it was. And this tree was bound for 7 years. That's what you'll read when you go through Daniel chapter 4. But remember what the question is. Is this vision and the words that it uses symbolic language? Now, I just want to make a little comment here that whether a vision is symbolic or literal, you need to have literal words to tell you how to read that vision. So there's always literal words. But do the words convey a symbolic language or a literal language? That's what we're trying to figure out here. Well, let's just do a comparison of 2 different kinds of trees. Why don't we just say that the tree of Daniel 4 looked like this, a beautiful cedar tree. It's tall, it's got beautiful branches. The beasts of the field are under it, and they have cover and protection and shade. But what about this tree? The one on the right side. Would you consider this to be a symbolic tree? If the king had a dream like this, of the trunk was purple, and it had eyes through the trunk and on the branches, and there was scales on the trunk. And oh my, instead of leaves, there was wings of, looks like wings of fowl or something. Would you consider that to be a symbolic tree? Yes, you would. And if you had a dream of a tree that looked like this, would you be willing to say, I don't know what that dream would be with a tree that looked like that? This is the difference between two different trees. A literal tree that you could see in your backyard and a symbolic tree. Now we just want to take a little detour. There are some prophetic keys that are given in Daniel that help us to understand how visions work. And before you do anything, we all need to understand that prophecy is an exact science. It's like math and chemistry and physics. There's an answer, yes or no. There's no gray areas in prophecy. It's an exact science. And exact sciences like math and chemistry and physics all follow rules. But when it comes to prophecy, lots of people like to use this fancy word for rules called hermeneutics. So we are going to use some hermeneutics. In the Daniel book, I don't use that great big word. I just call it prophetic key. We will use prophetic keys to unlock some of these symbols and whatnot. And there's 30 of them in the book. And do you think that there could be new prophetic keys? Absolutely, lots of them, but we're trying to keep it simple. So we'll have a little bit of that in here, although I won't be explaining it much because that's in another teaching. And the key looks like that, just a good old key to unlock the visions. Let's start with our very first section of how to understand timelines. This thing about similes and metaphors. And in the book, we would be using prophetic key. It's called 21A and 21B. And this is where we're going to have some English lessons. And what I usually find is that most of us, when we got out of school, out of high school, we just thought, oh, thank goodness, we're done with that. No more math, no more English, let's just get busy. And you know what? A lot of us forgot some of our basic grammar rules, including me. And some of that is that we need to know what a noun is, a verb, an adjective, and an adverb. Those are really, really important. We need to know our tenses when we're reading. Is it past tense, present tense, or future tense? That's going to make a great big difference on how we're understanding things. But you know what? We also need to know what a simile is and a metaphor, just in case we forgot. So let's see what prophetic key 21 has to say. It says this: literal language may use figures of speech. Figures of speech, such as similes and metaphors. That's all they are. Similes and metaphors are just a figure of speech. So we're going to first look at similes. Find out what a simile is, because you know what? I didn't know. I had to learn this all over again. Prophetic key number 21 about similes has this to say. Similes are figures of speech in which two essentially unlike things are compared. Similes are tools of language which often employ the words like or as, using a story as an illustration. So when you see these words like or as, you're probably working with a simile. Here's some examples from Revelation 9. It will say the locusts were like horses, or it will say locust hair was as the hair of women, or locust tails were like unto scorpions. It's a comparison. The locusts weren't horses, but whatever these locusts were something like a horse. They were fast, you know, they forward progressive movement, right? But anyway, that is language of similes, okay? When you see like or as. Or we could call it literal language. This is not symbolic language. This is literal language. When you see that, even though there's symbolism all around, that is literal language. Prophetic key 21B is talking about metaphors. And this is the description of a metaphor. A metaphor is a word or a phrase denoting an idea which represents something else, a word or phrase that represents something else. Something like this. He sure was a bear this morning at the breakfast table. So what about this man? Was he really a bear? Or was he just really grumpy? I think this man was not a bear. He was just really grumpy. This is where a metaphor compares two things by a word or a phrase. Then you're dealing with a metaphor. But guess what, everybody? Is it symbolic language because it does that? We'll find out. Some examples from Revelation 9:1. You will see it says, I saw a star fall from heaven. This is denoting a created being, not a real star. Some other examples that you've probably heard using metaphors is, I smell a rat. Or you might have heard somebody say, there's a monkey in the woodpile when something doesn't sound right. Or maybe they'll say something smells fishy when they hear a story or whatever. You just know something's not right. Well, you know what? They probably weren't smelling a real rat, and there was no real monkey in the woodpile, and there probably wasn't any smelly fish. But it's just a metaphor that something's not right. There's something that has to be figured out here. So that's how metaphors work. And yes, they are just plain literal language. So we need to watch for them. There are some examples of similes and metaphors in Daniel chapter 4. Let's take a look at verse 20. It says, the tree that thou sawest, which grew and was strong, this is Daniel talking, whose height reached unto the heaven, and the sight thereof to all the earth, whose leaves were fair, and the fruit thereof much, and in it was meat for all. Now look what Daniel says. He's comparing the tree. And he says, it is thou, O king. This is a metaphor. It is thou, O king. Daniel's metaphor, when he says the tree that thou sawest, it is thou, O king. Or guess what, everybody? Daniel could have used a simile. He could have said, you, O king, are like that great tree. Or he could have said, you, O king, are as that great tree. It would have meant exactly the same thing, but he used a metaphor. In literal language, in Daniel chapter 4, the king is compared to a great tree. The tree was an ordinary tree, and the king was an ordinary king. There wasn't any symbolism there at all. So let's conclude this little section on similes and metaphors. Remember, similes compare by using words such as like or as, and metaphors also compare, but they use phrases instead of the words like or as. Literal language often uses similes or metaphors. When you start reading your scriptures, especially in prophecies, and there's lots of prophets in the Old Testament, just kind of watch for this kind of language and see what you find. Prophetic key number 19, this is what it says. Daniel 4 is written in literal language. Therefore, it has to be interpreted literally. We were trying to determine if this vision is symbolic or literal, and there's a very important reason for that has to do with that 7-year timeline. But in this first section out of 7, we have determined that the language in Daniel 4 is 100% literal. What we want to do when we go through these 7 sections is to see if it's always 100% literal. Okay, let's go on to section number 2. Understanding timelines, the difference between symbolic language and literal language. In prophetic key number 18, it has this to say. The Bible is to be understood in its most obvious or literal sense. Guess what, everyone? Unless a figure or symbol is employed. symbol, a symbol. So when you're reading the scriptures, you always read it in its most literal sense, exactly what the literal words are saying. But when there's a symbol, then you have to understand how to work with these hermeneutic principles to understand how to decode that symbol. And these are all some English lessons. So we just said, if the king saw a symbolic tree, something that looked like this, just maybe the purple trunk would have scales and eyes. It had lots of unusual branch formation. What if this tree had wings instead of leaves? What if this tree would have showed up in his dream? Would this have been considered a symbolic tree? What do you think? If this is a symbolic tree, if that's the kind of tree he saw in his dream, in that case, Daniel would have needed to have divine interpretation through another vision or dream, just like he had in Daniel chapter 2. And Gabriel most likely would have been commissioned to give Daniel understanding of this tree, because I'm not sure Daniel would have known what this tree meant if he wouldn't have had divine interpretation. Okay, this is really important. But when Daniel heard the description of the tree, it didn't sound like this, with purple trunk and wings for leaves. Here's the big question, everybody, and I wish I could have given this out for homework. Does Daniel, Prophet Daniel, have an interpreter for this vision? There was an interpretation given to him in Daniel chapter 2. He went to sleep that night, the vision was given to him, and the interpretation. What happens in chapter 4? Is there an interpreter that comes along? Well, without going through all the verses, I'm just going to tell you, no, there is no interpreter given to Daniel for this vision, none whatsoever. So rule number 1, here we're going with a hermeneutic rule. For a symbolic vision, guess what, everyone? Daniel needs an interpreter. And rule number 2, you can figure it out by yourself. For a literal vision, guess what? Daniel does not need an interpreter. It's just that simple. So just remember them. These are all simple concepts. So just remember that for right now. There were 3 contemporary prophets with Daniel when he was over there in Babylon. There was Ezekiel, and there was also Jeremiah. They were all working together around the same time. Daniel was exiled about 606 BC into Babylon. He was heaven's divine ambassador right to the court of the king, and he was to make known Yah's divine will, and he was also to secure cooperation on behalf of Yah's people that were living in Babylon. But then we also have Ezekiel. He's a very interesting prophet. He was exiled to Babylon around 10 years later. And he had the very same message as Jeremiah, but his message was for those already in captivity. If you remember, Jeremiah's messages were going on for 40 years before that. And Jeremiah, what happened to Prophet Jeremiah, who's known as the weeping prophet? For 40 years, he was given the responsibility and the challenging task of warning the people in Judah and Jerusalem that when they go into captivity, that they're to go there and behave themselves, just to go, but they wouldn't listen. Well, he didn't go to Babylon. He remained with the Jews who were left there in Judea, and eventually he ended up in Egypt. They took him down there. He just really had a hard 40 years. These 3 prophets worked together, and they all had the very same message. And this is what it was. Accept your condition of exile. You must submit to the king of Babylon for 70 years, and then you're going to come back to your land. That was the message. Just go there, live there like normal, right in the court or right in the city of the king. And after 70 years, you'll get to come back. Daniel was inside the court of the king, and the rest of the people were on the outside with Ezekiel. Now, it's really interesting, excuse me, what was happening with Daniel and Ezekiel right there in Babylon. Let's look at a few facts. And I always like to keep things in order of date because you'll begin to see things if you have that forward progressive movement of your dates. Remember, we said in 606, that was when Daniel was exiled to Babylon. And around 10 years later, Ezekiel is exiled to Babylon. 597 approximately was when Ezekiel went to Babylon. But look, 3 years later, 594, is when Ezekiel 17 was written. In 588, nearly 10 years after Ezekiel got to Babylon, he wrote Ezekiel 31 and 32. This is really important to remember. It was about trees, something about trees. In 569 BC is the approximate time when Nebuchadnezzar had this dream about this tree. So it's quite a long time after Daniel was there. So over 30 years, right? About 35 years at least. So Daniel had been in the king's court for a very long time when Nebuchadnezzar had this dream of this tree. Now, the interesting thing is that Daniel had access to Ezekiel's prophecies, look, about 20 years in advance of this dream. These prophecies of Ezekiel 17, 31, and 32 have some very interesting information. And don't kid yourself, he would have had access to Jeremiah's work as well. Well, Ezekiel had some prophecies of some other trees. We should look at these and see what is going on. But first, I would like to give you a prophetic fact. Assyria had at one time surpassed Egypt in power and prominence, but it had not been able to escape the divine destruction of Yahweh. They had been top dog, okay, but they came under those consequences. These chapters warn the Pharaoh of Egypt. We're going to look at a little bit of them coming up. These chapters warn the Pharaoh of Egypt that his fate would be the same as the Assyrian nation. Why? If he did not change his ways. So now we're talking about Egypt and Assyria right now, not Babylon. This is what it says in Ezekiel 31:18 and 32:11. Yet you too, Pharaoh, you're going to be brought down with the trees to the earth below. You will lie among those killed by the sword. This is what our sovereign Yahweh says to you, Pharaoh. The sword of the king of Babylon is going to come against you. Did you hear that? The sword of the king of Babylon is going to come against you. This was the warning to Egypt, the Pharaoh of Egypt. The prophetic warning, Pharaoh was reminded of Assyria's fate. If Egypt does not turn from its wicked ways, guess what? Judgment is going to come against her, just like it had come against Assyria. And thus, there was a prophetic fulfillment. Once Egypt came under Babylonian rule, guess what happened? She never again achieved her former glorious status in the world. That was it. Curtains. And you know what, everybody? Daniel saw this fulfillment. Ezekiel prophesied about it, and Daniel had those prophecies, and he saw this fulfilled. He would have heard, even though he was in the king's court. Remember, always remember, that Daniel had access to Ezekiel's prophecies for well over 20 years. You could go through those prophecies quite a few times in 20 years. The fulfillment of Ezekiel's prophecies also provided what? The interpretation for the dream of King Nebuchadnezzar. And guess what else? Daniel immediately knew what the dream meant. As soon as he heard the dream from the king, he knew what it meant. But what it says in chapter 4 is this: Daniel was astonished for 1 hour, and his thoughts were troubling him a lot. You'll find that in verse 19. When you look up astonished, it says this: to be stunned, amazed, overwhelmed. Daniel was stunned. Daniel was amazed. Daniel was overwhelmed for 1 hour, and his thoughts were troubling him. 1 hour. Can you imagine standing there in front of the king for 1 hour? The king just said the dream. Daniel had given him the interpretation of his dream in chapter 2. Why was there such a delay for Daniel for 1 whole hour? Oh my, he must have been fixed in thought. And all this profound silence before the king, how does he break the news to the king? Because Daniel immediately knew the fearful consequences of this dream concerning the king. He knew exactly. And Daniel also knew that if you reveal bad news to the king, it could end up in a death decree. Remember, there was a death decree for the Chaldeans in chapter 2 because they couldn't give him the interpretation. But you know what? King Nebuchadnezzar, he assured Daniel that he was going to be safe. He didn't have to worry. And so Daniel, with utmost courtesy and respect to the king, he replied, "My lord, the dream be to them that hate thee, and the interpretation to thy enemies. O king, I don't want this dream to be for you. Oh, wouldn't it be better to be for your enemies?" That's what Daniel said. And I'm pretty sure that the king knew he was in trouble. Well, let's look at verse 11. Let's see how it applies to King Nebuchadnezzar. Let's take it by phrase by phrase. It says, the tree grew. What does that mean? Well, Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom was glorious. It had been known to all the known world. He had conquered the world that was known in those days. And his kingdom was becoming more glorious over the years. And then it goes on in verse 11, says, and the tree was strong. Oh yes, this tree was well proportioned in height and mass and foliage. So Babylon was proportioned in wealth. It had military strength and social status. Military strength could refer to that trunk that was firmly fixed in the earth, providing safety from any enemy. And then it goes on to say, and the height thereof reached unto heaven. Oh yes, Babylon's kingdom, King Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, it extended in every single direction. That tree said just that. And then it says, and the sight of the tree was to the end of all the earth. Oh, you know, that kingdom was so conspicuous that it was known everywhere, meaning that Nebuchadnezzar was a sovereign that had universal sway, and everybody would be subject to him. But Daniel goes on. In verse 12, there's a little bit more. It says, the leaves thereof were very, very fair. Oh, yes, they were, because Babylon was in the prime of its growth and its life. There was no signs of decay in Babylon, only vigorous and a healthy growth resembling a monarch in his glory, sitting on his throne. And the tree had a lot of fruit. And yes, Babylon was full of goodness, life, and vitality. Just go and research Babylon. You'll find out what was going on there. And it says that the tree had meat for all. Oh yes, Babylon had food for all. I understand that Babylon had enough food and lots of water running through it to keep all of their people alive for over 7 years, that they were a protected fortress. Nobody could get in there. Well, this indicates the dependence of the multitudes upon the king to provide food and liberal favors. Isn't a king supposed to take care of his subjects? And then it goes on to say, the beasts of the field had shadow under it, and the fowls in the heaven dwelt in the boughs. Does that not mean that the shade represented the blessings of protection and peace, care for the widows, the fatherless, and the poor? Is that not what King Nebuchadnezzar was supposed to be doing for his people? And then Daniel says, and all flesh was fed of it. Oh yes, the king, as the tree, was to furnish protection, shelter, and food for all the citizens. Well, that sounded pretty good. Now let's look at verse 13. How is this verse applied to the king? Because here comes some bad news. And behold, a watcher and a holy one came down from heaven. Oh dear, this character, this watcher was a holy one right straight from heaven. In Psalms 103 verse 20, let's read what it has to say. Bless Yahuwah, ye his angels that excel in strength, that do his commandments, hearkening on to the voice of his word. Really good counsel there in Psalms 103. And then verse 14, along comes the bad news. Hew down that tree. That's what it says. Yes, divine orders are given to the watcher to take the king off his throne. Take him out right away. Right away? Well, we'll find out. Cut off his branches, shake off his leaves, and scatter the fruit, and let the beasts get away from under it, and the fowls from his branches. So what does this mean? The king and his kingdom were to be utterly stripped of all the glory and all the beauty that Babylon had had. Calamity, humiliation, and desolation were imminent. The glory of the kingdom is definitely at stake, and those subjects are at a loss, and they aren't going to have a leader. Verse 15 continues. It's an application to the king. It says, leave the stump of his roots in the earth. Oh, could this be some good news? Well, Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom are not completely dead. In time, guess what? A new shoot is going to spring forth, and it will give life again to the kingdom. And though the king falls, vitality remains in the root of the kingdom of Babylon. In other words, the king would be restored to his reason and his power. And then Daniel says, leave the stump in his roots in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass. Well, what does that mean? This banding is given to any valuable stump. Why? Because it preserves it from being dried out and plowed under. And then it says, in the tender grass of the field, let this stump be wet with the dew of heaven. Well, what does that mean? It means that the king would remain out of doors. He would be excluded from the palace. He would be out there in the grass, in the dew. In Job 14:7, there's some encouraging words. For there is hope of a tree, if it be cut down, that it will sprout again, and the tender branch will not cease. So the promise was given to the king that he was going to be cut down, but that he would be king again. But it goes on in verse 15 and on to verse 16. Daniel says, let his portion be with the beasts. Well, this is what's going to happen, King Nebuchadnezzar. It says, let the king live just like the beasts do in the grassy fields. And then verse 16, the first part says, let his heart be changed from a man's, and let a beast's heart be given unto him. Yes, that means that the king is going to live very contently in nature, just like the beasts do. And now we come to a timeline. This is how long. Let 7 times pass over him. Daniel is telling the king that the king will stay in this beast-like condition until he is restored after an appointed period of time. A timeline for being disobedient. In Psalms 107, verse 40, I like what it says here. He causeth them to wander in the wilderness where there is no way. But guess what? He can restore. And that's what we're talking about, is restoration. Verse 33 also has some more information about the king. It says hairs were growing like eagle's feathers. What could that mean? Just as the eagle is king of the birds, so Nebuchadnezzar was still to be the king of Babylon. In Daniel chapter 7, that second vision, we find that Babylon is represented as a lion. And what is a lion? It's a king of the beasts. Well, Nebuchadnezzar is being compared to the king of the birds. Very interesting. The eagle as the king of the birds and the lion as the king of the beasts. Let's just take a moment to have a conclusion on Daniel 4 on this section. Have we got symbolic language here, or is it literal language? You know what? There was no symbolic language. There was no reason to have an interpreter for Daniel. There is no interpreter sent to explain the meaning of the vision. You can read all the way through chapter 4. You won't find an interpreter that comes to Daniel to tell him what the dream meant. The king is merely compared to a great big tree, just like those kings of Assyria and Egypt. Those kings were cut down, just like a tree can be cut down, and they never had their kingdom again. And Daniel knew, he knew those prophecies, and when he heard this of a tree that was being cut down in Babylon, he knew that was the king. But this tree was different because it was going to be bound with that stump with iron and brass, meaning that it would sprout up again. The language is all 100% literal. That's really important to know, because when we start working with timelines, we have to know if the language and the vision is literal or symbolic. It makes a big difference. We're now ready to go on to the third part of this lesson today. And this might be a little bit tricky, so just try to follow me on it. What is the difference between the word interpretation and application? I never knew that there was a difference between these. In fact, most people don't know. So let's think about it. The prophetic key number 20 is this. Prophecy written in literal language uses application to align historical events with Scripture. Daniel chapter 11 is a perfect chapter. That whole fourth vision from Daniel 10, 11, and 12 is completely written in literal language. But Daniel 11 is the actual part of the part of the vision that's giving you the outline of the kingdoms, okay? It's all written in literal language. So what you do is you go to historical events and you align the historical events with what you're reading in the literal language of Daniel 11. That's what this is saying here. Prophecy that is written in literal language in chapter 11 is part of the fourth vision, is part of that prophecy, uses application to align the historical event with the scripture or with the prophecy. Let's look at understanding interpretation. In 2 Peter 1:20, it says this, above all, you must understand that no prophecy of scripture came about by the prophet's own interpretation, okay? The prophet can't just decide on his own if it's a prophecy in symbolic language. So prophetic key number 16 is going to talk about this. This is symbolic interpretation. It is used when the prophetic word picture is of something that is not real, like that image was not a real image in those days, not a real idol, okay? So we're talking about a word picture of something that is not real. From the Webster's 1828 dictionary, he defines interpretation like this: to explain the meaning of visions or dreams, to lay open what is not understood. That's what Webster's has to say. So we're just going to pop back into Daniel chapter 2. Just going to do this very, very lightly. Probably most of you know this, but for somebody that doesn't, but it will be a comparison to what we're doing in Daniel chapter 4. This was a dream that the king had of an image. It had a gold head, arms and chest of silver, and then the brass belly, iron legs, and then there was iron and clay mixed together for the feet and the toes. That's what the king saw. He had no idea what this might mean. So let's just look at part of it. The symbol, we're just dealing with one part here right now. The symbol of the image's head, it says it was fine gold. Prophetic key number 17 says this: the Bible will be used to interpret the symbol. Okay, the symbol is the head of fine gold. How do we figure out what that head of fine gold really means? So we will decode the symbol in verse 38 of chapter 2. And this is how Daniel decodes it. He says, "Thou, Nebuchadnezzar, art this head of gold." And what is the literal application of this gold head? The gold head represents the first kingdom called Babylon. That's how it was interpreted. You have your symbol, it's a symbol. Then you have to decode it. Thou, Nebuchadnezzar, art this head of gold. And the literal application of the symbol means that we're talking about the kingdom of Babylon. Well, let's look a little bit further at this Daniel chapter 2 and just see what the scriptural documentation is for the first kingdom that is mentioned in this wonderful prophecy. In Daniel 2, verses 36 to 38, it says this: "This is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king." And Daniel goes on to say, "Thou, O king, Yahuwah of heaven, hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold." And you can also see Jeremiah 50, verses 7 and 17, and also 43 and 44. Don't forget that Jeremiah had been prophesying for 40 years before they went to Babylon. So this was already in the works. So the Bible is using visions that were given to Jeremiah to help interpret this. So this gold head is interpreted as Babylon. And of course, King Nebuchadnezzar is the leader of Babylon at this time. Let's move on to the second kingdom. We're looking for scriptural documentation. We have a question mark on this second kingdom here of the silver arms and the chest. In Daniel 2, verse 39, Daniel says, "And after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee." He's not talking about another king, he's talking about another kingdom. When we look in Daniel 8:20, and I believe that Libby's already been talking about this, it has the interpretation right there from Gabriel. "The ram which thou sawest having two horns are the kings of Media and Persia." Right there, the interpretation from the angel. Jeremiah also has something in 51 verse 11. "Yahuwah hath raised up the spirit of the kings of the Medes, for his device is against Babylon to destroy it." And yes, when you look in history, that's exactly what happens. So we have Daniel 8 and Jeremiah 51 that are giving us the interpretation. The Bible is giving the interpretation that Medo-Persia is the second kingdom. Well, let's go on to the third kingdom. In Daniel 2, verse 39, Daniel goes on to say, "And another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth." In Daniel 8:21, we have the interpretation. It says, "And the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king." So, what's the interpretation from the Bible, from the scriptures? It is that Greece is the third kingdom. And of course, history confirms that. So we have one more to go. The fourth kingdom. We want to look at the scriptural documentation for the fourth kingdom, because there's 4 kingdoms listed in Daniel chapter 2. Only 4. Only 4 kingdoms, all the way from Daniel chapter 2 right down to the very end of time. Even though that fourth kingdom is going to be split up into 4 components, okay? But it's still of the same. Chapter 2, verse 40 says, "And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron." And in Daniel 11, we find this. Daniel 11 is a literal vision. "Then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom." Well, we can look in Luke 2:1 to find out who that is. "There went out a decree from Caesar Augustus. And who was he? He was a Roman. There went out a decree from Caesar Augustus, that Roman, that all the world should be taxed. And we know that that is exactly what happened when Joseph and Mary were on their way to Nazareth. It was because of his decree. And who was in power at that time? Well, the Bible tells us. Caesar Augustus was from Rome. So secular history is always a second witness. This is one way that the Bible interprets the kingdoms. We just have to look and see. So now what we want to do is look at this word application. We were just looking at interpretation, how the Bible had to interpret to understand the symbols in that vision. Now we want to look at this term application. In prophetic key number 18, it says this: the Bible is to be understood in its most obvious or literal sense, unless a figure or a symbol is employed. So you have to watch. Is there a symbol or is there not? In prophetic key number 20, this is what it says for literal interpretation. Literal interpretation is used when the prophetic word picture is of something real. Literal events are given application to the word picture. Webster's has this to say about the word application. It's just principles are applied in a practical way. Isn't that what Daniel did? In a practical way, he applied King Nebuchadnezzar to be like that great tree. It was just an application. King, it's you. It's you and only you. It's nobody else. You know what? Literal language is actually really easy to work with, but you just need to know how to distinguish between literal and symbolic. In chapter 4, we're talking about a literal tree and we're talking about a literal king. And Daniel is using a metaphor. It's just easy grammar. He says, the tree that thou sawest, it is thou, O king. It was just application. He didn't have to have a prophecy to tell him anything. He had prophecies before, from Assyria and from Egypt. When those trees, those kings got cut down, he knew that they didn't come back. So he just made the application. It's really actually pretty easy. Just application. That tree, it represents you. And guess what, everybody? There is no symbolic interpretation needed. There's no symbols. So we don't have to go looking to try to find a way to make an interpretation because it's just literal language. In Daniel 4, 9 and 18, we find this word interpretation. And this word interpretation is used 30 times in Daniel's book. In Strong's 6622, it says to open up. It means to open up the meaning or to understand the proper application. So interpretation can be to open up the meaning of something that's symbolic or to open up and understand the proper application. Here are two examples. In verse 9, it's the king that says, tell me the interpretation. The king doesn't say, tell me the application. He doesn't understand any of this. He thinks it's a symbol. He thinks the tree is a symbol. So the king is asking for an interpretation, okay? In verse 18, he says, make known unto me the interpretation. What the king is asking is, how does that tree apply to me? Why was this vision given to me? But remember, the king doesn't understand how prophecy works, so he's using the word interpretation. But really, he should have said application because there's no symbols involved. So what is this difference between King Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel? What's the difference between the king's viewpoint and Daniel's viewpoint? Because there is a difference. This is what it is. The king really did need an interpretation. He thought this was a symbolic dream, just like he had with that image, but not with Daniel. Daniel did not need to be given an interpretation. He did not need an angel to come and tell him what it meant. because he totally understood what was happening here when the king relayed it to him. Remember, he was astonished for 1 hour. It wasn't that he didn't know what it meant. He didn't know how to tell the king this bad news. So what did Daniel do? He merely made a practical application to the king. He used the historical facts from Ezekiel, and he just made application what happened to those kings that were likened to trees, great trees, and he just applied it to King Nebuchadnezzar. It's application. He just applied the prophecy from what happened with the other kings. But it was an interpretation for the king. It absolutely was. In summary, Daniel knew the application because he said in verse 19, "My Lord, the dream be to them that hate thee." And the interpretation, he could have used application. He could have said, "And may the dream apply to your enemies." And then he says, "But king, the tree that thou sawest, it is you, O king." So this application, everybody, the application that Daniel received did not come through a dream. It did not come through a vision. The application to the king did not come from Angel Gabriel, and it didn't need any symbolic interpretation. He just simply applied to the king. You got caught, and you're going to get cut down. That's basically what happened. So in 3 of these points out of 7, we are just working with literal language. There's no symbols here at all. And that's good news, because if there's symbols, it really does change the timelines quite a bit. And that's the end of part 1. In part 2, we're going to take a little closer look at the timelines and just find out what's happening with the timeline. And I want you to go and read chapter 4 if you have some time, and find out how many times that timeline of 7 times is mentioned. And I'd like you to kind of take note of where you find it. Where is it found in that vision, and how many times? So everyone, that's the end.